Trent.
Hi, my name is Trent Watts and I'm with the Hub City Turners here in Saskatoon. Today we're going to do a demo on how to make a goblet. I'm going to start out with a chunk of mahogany that's roughly just over 6 inches long and 2.5 to 2 3/4 square. It's kind of handy to know where the center is. So there's a lot of different ways you can do that. So this device is made by Veritas from Lee Valley. They have a blade at 45 degrees so that you could put whatever size piece of wood you want in there. Then you give it a crack like that, turn it once, and then that gives you your center. So that's a fairly easy way. If you don't have one of those, then it's fairly easy to guess where the center is. I just use my finger as a guide and I go across and then turn the block without turning the location of my fingers on the pencil, and then I've got another center. So in this case, I'm not matching up any kind of laminated wood where I would need to have a very accurate center. So this will be fine because once I put it on the lathe, then it will automatically center once I start turning. So one of the things that I like to do is use what I call a safe drive. It's a small point with a circle around it, and then it just uses friction to drive it. And that's as opposed to something like this, which is a spur drive. And a spur drive has these points which dig into the wood, so it gives you a more positive force to drive your piece, but it also has more potential to do tear out if you get a catch. Once you get proficient at it, the catches become less often, but when you're starting out, one of these safe drives works really well. So then I just put that in the center, give it a little tap, then I move the tailstock up, lock it in place, and then as I move this in, now I've got my reasonably close to center, as close as I really need. One of the things that is extremely important when you're turning is safety. Eye protection is absolutely critical. So these ones are safety as well as prescription. It's also very handy to have something like a face shield like this. I'm not going to be wearing this today because of our camera. Okay, so before you ever turn a lathe on, it's really important that by hand you turn this. Particularly if you've got something on here that's square. I may have this like this and think I'm perfectly safe, and I turn it on and that corner catches, and then in this case it's not going to do any damage because we've got a friction drive. So I want to pull the tool rest back out, and then I turn that by hand, and now I know it's safe to turn the lathe on. People often ask, what height should you put the tool rest at? Most of the time, there are exceptions, but most of the time you can be fairly safe by having the tool rest so that the cutting edge of your tool is at about center. So that's on a bit of an angle, and I'll show you why we want that on an angle in a moment. Okay, so this is a good height for me now. And I want to lock that in place so it doesn't move, because I don't want to be leaning against it and have that tool rest move into the wood. So now I'm just going to turn it by hand, and I've got a lathe that has an electronic variable speed, so I can just turn it up. And then to be safe, I want to rub this part of the tool, which is called the bevel, against the wood. So I hold this down as I bring it up, then now you can see that that's starting to catch that little corner, and it's moving across. So if I come off and I want to start again, I rub my bevel by holding it there, and then I bring the handle up. Now if I'm doing this in the production sense, I would get my body right close to the lathe like this. I hold the tool against my hip. I use this hand to hold the tool against the tool rest. So I rub that bevel, and then instead of using my arm, I would use my whole body like that to move up. Then I can go back and forth, and this fleshy bit of my hand here is rubbing against the tool rest, and that gives me control. Put my hand like this, and then I can move in here. Now I've got control. And I move my whole body back and forth, as opposed to just, if I go like this and move my arms, I don't have nearly as much control as if I pull this in. I'm just going to speed that up a little bit. Okay, now you can see what happens there. If I push this in and it stops, this doesn't do any damage because it's just sitting there spinning. And that tells me that I'm getting a little bit of wear around that drive. So then I need to take and just turn my tailstock in a little bit tighter, and then that will provide the pressure again. And as I remove the wood off these corners, then the face of my tool rest is further away from the wood, and that provides a bit less control. So at this point, I want to just move my tool rest in a little bit, make sure that nothing's going to touch, and then I can turn that on. So now we'll just finish turning this round. Now that it's round, we want to make a foot on one end so that we can turn it around and attach it to the chuck. I want this part of the tenon to be at right angles. So if I put that ruler in there, I'm pretty close. That will work fine. And I also want this distance here to be less than the distance on the chuck, which I'll show you in a second. Okay, now we're finished with the between center part. Then I can put this piece in. And what I was trying to show you before was this part of the foot needs to rub against this part of the chuck. I don't want this part to be touching back here. So when I put this in, I want there to be, and you can just see that there's a gap there so that it's not actually touching the back of the jaws. So now I can tighten this up. I'll just very loosely put it in there, and then I'll put this into that same hole, and I'll just put a little bit of tension on there so that the face of the wood goes tight against the jaws. Now I'll tighten this up. Okay, the next step is I want to form a rough shape of this goblet so that I can get my proportions right. So we're going to go to the lathe now, and we're going to just get some rough shapes. So now we're going to remove the tailstock so that we can get set up to do the hollowing. Okay, the next step is to hollow out the portion of the goblet that would hold fluid if you're actually doing something with it. This is one way to do it. Lots of people would use a Jacob's chuck in the tailstock, and then you can hollow this out. I find by the time I get this all set up, it takes me almost as long as to just hollow it out with the other tools that I'll show you how to use in a second. So one way is to just use a regular deep fluted gouge. This is the same gouge that I would use if I was doing bowl work. So I'm going to start by rubbing the bevel, that's again this part here, and then as I bring my handle forward, then you can see how that point will start to come in contact. And as I turn it up like this, it's going to be more aggressive. If I approach this wood just like this, it could just pop that whole thing and flip it right out because it's very aggressive. But if I'm rubbing my bevel, I have all kinds of control. If these two surfaces are more or less straight up and down and parallel, then I'm going to have very little cutting, but it's going to be very safe. And so then as I turn it like that, then I'm going to engage the wood and cause it to come up. So we're going to show you how to do that. Turn it by hand to make sure everything's good. Rub my bevel, bring it up. Now you can see it start to make contact. Now at this point, I'm getting so it's hard to get around, so I may choose to use this almost like a drill. So again, I turn it the other way, but again, it's straight up and down, and then I find the center, and I just push it in. I want these edges to be almost straight up and down. If I go in here like this, and that comes in contact there, even though this bit of bevel may be rubbing, it's very likely to pull the whole thing out. But if I'm holding it like this and I just turn it a tiny bit, then it cuts that fairly nicely. Using this quick technique, you can determine the depth of a bowl. You close one eye, line up the two sides of the bowl, put your finger on the stick, and then put it on, and you can see pretty close to how deep you are. To show you another tool that can be used for hollowing end grain, I'm using this tool that Elio Menace from Lloydminster makes. It has a nice heft to it, and it has a small end so that it's very easy to get inside. You can also add any length of handle to give you a counterbalance if you have to hang over quite far. To use this tool, you hold those edges almost vertical. If you turn it like this, it's too aggressive and it could possibly pull the whole piece out. I can feel that the tool is bumping. And so what is happening is this wood the chips are building up in there. So I just want to clean that out so that I don't end up with getting a catch because of that tool bouncing around. So I can just feel this with my fingers and say, okay, I'm still pretty thick in here. Getting close here, might want that just a little bit thinner, but we also have to do a bit more finishing on the outside. So we're just going to get a little bit deeper and a little bit thinner on the near the bottom. Okay, now it's time to refine the shape a little bit more on the outside so that we can then make sure we get our wall thickness correct. I want to make a couple of captured rings, so I want to leave this portion of the stem large enough to do that. I've now switched to a skew to finish the outside of the goblet. This skew is sharpened like a carving tool, and the edge is finely honed on a leather strop so that it makes a very smooth cut. So we've still got a few little marks in here, but those are all going to come out very easily with sandpaper. So now we've got our more or less our final shape. So now I want to finish hollowing the inside and making the wall reasonably close to the same thickness all the way through. So when I was using that other tool, there was a fair bit of tear out. You can see here where the wood has been torn, and that will easily sand, well, it doesn't easily sand out, it will sand out, but I'm going to try a slightly different technique with a smaller deep fluted gouge. Okay, when I feel this with my fingers, I can feel there's a little bit of a ridge right in about here, and then I've also got tear out down here. So I'm going to use my deep fluted gouge and see if I can clean that up just a little bit. When I go like this, you can hear quite a bit of vibration. If I put my hand on here and I just use my thumb to help stop tool vibration on the tool, then I can get a lot better control. So these are two tools that have a very similar profile. The difference is on this one, it's not 90 degrees coming up here, but it's much closer than this one. Okay, and so this is, and I don't know what the angle is. I never worry about the actual number. In my case, what I want to do is use this one right near the bottom. I'm just going to try and demonstrate that down inside the goblet. With this tool, if I'm rubbing the bevel back here, and then I come down around here, at about this point, the handle of my tool starts to rub here and my bevel has come off, and all it's touching is this tiny little point, and it just skates all over. If I use the tool with the bevel angle much closer to 90, as I put it here, I've got to have my handle way back here. But as I come down here, now I can still rub that bevel and not have the tool hit the not have the piece of wood hit the handle of the tool. And so this is a good tool for just doing that last little bit, and I should get a good cut. But I'm going to just sharpen this tool first just to make sure. So that tool cleaned up the bottom quite nicely. Now we're going to go through a number of grits of sandpaper, completely sand the inside of the goblet, and then we will move on and do the captive rings. One of the things that I find for sanding that works well are these, you can buy these forceps at like Princess Auto or someplace like that, and if you have some of this foam back sandpaper, that works really well. I'm kind of out of it, so what I can do is wrap a piece of fresh sandpaper but still use the foam as a backing. Then if I hold it like that, I can go inside here, because at some point, sometimes it's just too deep for your finger. So now we've finished sanding the inside of the goblet, and we're going to define the base of the goblet, and we're going to prepare to make the captive rings. So at this point, I'm using the point of my detail gouge to identify where the captive rings are going to be. The more space there is between the captive rings, the easier they are to completely remove once you start doing the inside of the ring. Here you can see the corners are being knocked off with the detail gouge. And then we're going to use the ring tool with the curve to try and get in behind and eventually free up that ring. Before we get that ring completely free, we're going to stop and use some sandpaper to clean up the outside edge. It's a lot easier to sand it before the ring becomes free. Now the rings have been sanded, we're going to use the ring tool to go right in behind, and once the two sides meet, the ring will pop free. When the ring breaks free, the inside is rather rough, so I usually just make a little flat spot with my detail gouge, put a piece of sandpaper on there, and then we can sand the inside of the ring. So now we take, this is glue-backed sandpaper, which just works really well for this. So I put it on there, This is, I think it's a 150 grit. And basically we're just going to turn it on to that little flat spot. Now you turn the lathe on and just gently hold the ring against the sandpaper. If the sandpaper fills up, you can just change it and put a new piece on. So now we have the ring sanded. We're going to define the transition between the goblet portion and the stem. I like to make a nice crisp line where the upper portion of the stem meets the goblet. This next section shows how we fare the curve of the stem into the base. To prepare for the final sizing of the stem, I want to stabilize the open portion of the goblet. So I use this cone that comes with the one-way live center, and I can just very gently push it into the cone to help stabilize it so it doesn't vibrate when I'm turning that stem. Here I'm using the skew and I'm supporting the other side of the stem with my forefinger to help prevent vibration. We just want to get a nice transition so the stem is larger at the base and then comes down to a nice size where it meets the goblet at the top. So at this point, I'm not sure about this stem. I'm thinking this might be a bit too big, but I can't look at this. I never hold my wine glass on its side and look at it. Well, everything falls out, right? So the next step is to just undo the chuck, and then I can hold it in a vertical position, and we can hold it against a white wall, and we can then decide, is this the right distance from there? It looks to me like this could be a little bit longer. So I think we could still bring this back down a little bit more, maybe somewhere in about here, and then make that swoop up into the stem. I think that's what's bothering me, as opposed to this being too big right here. I think it just needs to be a bit longer. If I take it out of the chuck, I end up having a really tough time getting it back and making everything still centered. And already I'm liking the look of it better. So here we're just cleaning up the final bit so that we have less sanding to do. Now that we've finished the goblet, we're going to remove some of the wood between the base of the goblet and the chuck. That will make it so that we can get at the base and do an undercut so that it sits properly once we're all finished. I'm not completely happy with the size of the base, so here I'm just removing enough so that the base is more appropriately sized to the rest of the goblet. We now have the base small enough that we can finish sanding before we actually remove the goblet from the base. I find it useful after each grit of sandpaper to go with the grain so that I can remove the circular scratches from the previous grit. So now we've finished the sanding, we're going to use this little 1/4-inch scraper to just remove the bulk of the material from the base. Now we've taken it out of the chuck and we're just using a little saw to cut the base off. And we're left with a little nubbin that you can then finish by hand, use a chisel to cut it off, or you can use a micromotor tool. And then we sand the base up and we're all finished. So there we have, that's how I make a goblet. Here's the goblet after I put a final coat of shellac on it.